The biggest stories happening not just in right-wing media, but in Republican legal politics right now, and that is that with all the crime that's happening, the focus for the MAGA GOP is that a man threw a sandwich at a federal agent. So first and foremost, can I have your reaction to the fact that this is where their focus is?
Couple of things, Brian. First of all, you shouldn't throw sandwiches at police officers. I think we can all agree on that. But here's the thing. Donald Trump has really abused law enforcement agencies in D.C. and the people of the District of Columbia by, using a law, frankly, in a way it was not intended. He grabbed control. He seized control of the local D.C. city cops, Metropolitan Police Department officers. He also sent soldiers, National Guard troops into the streets of Washington, D.C. He's taking federal officers like FBI agents and putting them on, police patrol on the street, something they are neither equipped to do nor trained to do. And the people of D.C. are angry. This individual, this young man who threw a sandwich at a federal officer and got arrested for it, was standing there yelling and screaming, "Fascists, get out. We don't want you in our city." And then he lost his head. He threw, and it's on videotape, Brian, he threw a sandwich, striking the police officer in the chest with a Subway sandwich, and then he ran, but they caught him. So there are a couple of takeaways here. First of all, it is a crime. If you assault somebody or commit a battery, more precisely, by striking them with something, that's a crime. Now, what kind of a crime is it? Well, let me tell you from experience, because I worked in the criminal justice system in D.C. as a prosecutor for decades, and I screened precisely these kinds of cases and crimes. What does screening mean? It means once an arrest was made and the police paperwork was filled out, they would bring it to my office, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia. We would have to decide what crime, if any, was committed and what, if anything, should be charged criminally. Let me tell you, Brian, just to check myself, I talked with two other retired career prosecutors from my old office, and these are people I worked with for decades, to make sure that I hadn't lost my prosecutorial instincts. We all concluded that this would only be charged as a misdemeanor offense. Why? Because there was no injury to the officer who was apparently wearing a bulletproof vest but had a sandwich come in contact with his chest. That is at most a misdemeanor offense. And under the federal law, because it was a federal officer, anybody scoring at home, it's 18 United States Code, Section 111, a misdemeanor offense assaulting a federal officer carries up to a year in jail. Now, did they decide to charge a misdemeanor offense? No. They charged this young man with a felony crime that carries up to 8 years in prison for a sandwich coming into contact with a police officer's chest. That, Brian, is prosecutorial overreach. I'm not saying this young man should not be held accountable, but you need to exercise rational prosecutorial discretion, especially when the streets of D.C. are saturated with police officers, both local and federal, and military troops where they really should not be deployed. It seems like the Trump administration and Pam Bondi's Department of Justice is determined to ratchet up the heat, the chaos, the disorder, and frankly, expect more of this. Expect more protests. I'm not saying other people will be throwing sandwiches at police officers, and I'm not trying to make light of it, but, this is wrong sort of all around.
Glenn, can you talk about this idea of inconsistent enforcement? So, like, for example, let's say I'm on a highway and 10 cars in front of me are going 80 miles per hour, and then a cop just decides to pull me over even though I'm going with the flow of traffic, and the entire batch of cars on the highway is all going the same speed. Can you talk about the implications of being the only one to face or contend with this kind of disproportionate enforcement?
Brian, that's a great question. Disproportionate or uneven or what seems to be unfair enforcement of the law generally does not give rise to a valid defense against a criminal charge unless it is something called selective prosecution or vindictive prosecution. I teach these concepts to my students at George Washington University. I'm not going to turn this into a law school or a criminal justice class, but let me just say the defenses of selective and vindictive prosecution are very, very difficult to prove. Rarely are they successfully deployed just because there is what seems to be selective enforcement of the law. But here is where I think this defendant might have a viable argument. You know, he could say, listen, Judge, or his attorney could say, listen, Judge, I can cite many examples showing that if I were carrying a Trump flag on a metal flagpole and instead of throwing a sandwich at that police officer, I beat that police officer, injured that police officer. While I was yelling, "Stop the steal, I support Donald Trump," you know, I probably wouldn't have been charged with a crime. And if I was, I would have been pardoned by Donald Trump. There are hundreds and hundreds of examples precisely like that. Therefore, the attorney could say, I am making a claim of vindictive and selective prosecution. You know, that may not be a winning defense, but it certainly does highlight the depraved disparity of what Donald Trump did, the benefits he bestowed on people who beat police officers at the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021, and how they just treated this young man who tossed a sandwich at a police officer.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I would joke and say that if only this guy had been wielding a flagpole and shoving it in the face of some of these police officers, then he would have not only been let go, but gotten a presidential pardon in the process, maybe even a job in the DOJ itself. And yet, it's ironic that when Trump and his lackeys and his stooges and henchmen see people whose political ideology doesn't comport with theirs, they're perfectly content to lay down the long arm of the law. But when you have people whose political ideologies comport with this administration, then they get a pardon, then they get a pat on the head, and in some instances, even a job in the White House or the DOJ that tried to prosecute them. And so this disparity is so egregious and so shameful, really, that I think it's important to bring it to light, even if by virtue of talking about it, there's nothing that we can do to stop it. At least people will see, you know, the way that this administration engages in favoritism and really, frankly, just makes a mockery of justice itself. So,
and Brian, let me just add really briefly that Pam Bondi has already made a public statement about this, and she engaged in unethical conduct. What she said as she was, you know, demeaning this defendant who was arrested for this assault, she said, you see this? He's a member of the deep state. You see what we have to contend with here? That is unethical. That is impermissible. It happens to be lying about somebody who has just been criminally charged. Prosecutors are not allowed to do that. We're not permitted to speak about and demean somebody who will perhaps be looking to impanel a fair and impartial jury to be tried on him throwing a sandwich and striking a police officer. So, you know, Pam Bondi really, every day, she disqualifies herself from the position that she's holding, Attorney General.
Well, look, we will continue to stay on top of this. If there are any updates on either this specific instance or legal news more broadly, highly recommend that if you're not following right now to both of our channels, if you're not subscribed to both of our channels, please make sure to subscribe. The links are both here on the screen. It's the best way to support our work. It is completely free and a great way to support independent media. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.